It was a summer afternoon in Sydney, 1935. People pressed against the glass of a public aquarium to see a live tiger shark, an attraction, a marvel, a danger contained. The shark thrashed, then vomited, and between waves of seawater and the crowd's cries, a human arm slid out, tattooed, severed, still. How did a human arm end up inside a shark on display in a city aquarium? And why has the full truth remained still unanswered? Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Eleanor Hart. This show looks at cases where key questions never got conclusive answers, cases that demand close reading of evidence, context, and the spaces between facts. Today, the shark arm case, one of Australia's strangest unsolved mysteries, where a single severed limb opened a doorway into organised crime, forensic limits, courtroom drama, and rumour. No music, no theatrics, just story, archival detail, and careful reasoning. Over the next hour, the next several segments, we'll cover the discovery at the aquarium, who the arm belonged to, the underworld that surrounded him, the investigation and trial, and the loose ends that kept this story alive for decades. I'll be joined by Dr. Marcus Llewellyn, who consults on cold cases and has studied policing and organised crime in 1930s Australia. Marcus, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Ellie. It's good to be here. This case, it sits at an odd crossroad of bizarre circumstance and real-world criminality, and that combination is why it's still talked about.
Let's start by setting the scene. Sydney in 1935 wasn't the Sydney we think of now. The city was still living through the effects of the Great Depression, unemployment, lean wages, and a public appetite for affordable entertainment. The harbour was the city's bloodstream, commerce, travel, and, for many, opportunity for both legitimate trade and illicit gain. There was also a public fascination with the sea. Sharks, in particular, held a special place in the popular imagination, fear mixed with curiosity. Shark fishing could be commercial showmanship. Aquariums were small spectacles where a dangerous beast became an object to be observed and, for a price, admired. That cultural backdrop matters. It explains why a captured tiger shark would be put on display, why crowds would gather, and why a strange incident involving that shark would rapidly become headline news rather than something buried at sea.
Right. And we shouldn't downplay the criminal atmosphere of the time. Sydney's underworld in the 1930s had networks built around gambling, nightclubs, boxing, and a lot of small-scale enterprises that blurred the line between legitimate and illegitimate business. People moved through those circles. Boxers, promoters, bookmakers, small-time crooks, and reputation mattered more than paperwork. So when something messy happens, like a disappearance, there's already fertile ground for rumour and for people to handle problems without police involvement.
Which is exactly the sort of environment that made the shark arm case so sticky. Now, the event itself, let me take you through it. A tiger shark was caught off the coast and brought to a Coogee Aquarium. It was intended as a public display, part curiosity, part show. Visitors watched as attendants fed it and as it circled in the tank. On the day in question, the shark began to thrash as if in distress. Staff noticed it, people leaned forward. Then, in a moment that must have looked grotesquely surreal, the shark vomited a human arm. Reports from the period described the scene as chaotic. Visitors stunned, staff scrambling, the arm tattooed, and, according to witnesses, fresh enough for investigators to identify distinctive marks. That vomited limb turned the incident into a homicide investigation overnight. It went from a curiosity show to a possible crime scene with one extraordinarily singular piece of evidence, an arm with tattoos.
Which is where the investigative path takes a strange turn. The police realized quickly that the arm could be identified by its tattoos, and in the absence of a full body or a murder scene, that arm became the central artifact. Imagine the pressure. This is the only physical human evidence available. In modern terms, we'd be looking for DNA, fibers, or digital trails. In 1935, investigators were working with tattoos, witness testimony, and what a pathologist could deduce from a limb separated from a body.
And they identified the arm as belonging to James, usually reported as Jimmy Smith. Who was Jimmy Smith? The records are not perfectly consistent, but here's what we can say with reasonable confidence. Smith was connected to the Sydney underworld. He had worked as a boxer and as a small-time businessman and had known links to gambling circles and the sort of precarious ventures that often went sideways. He was not a man with a spotless ledger. There were debts, disputes, and associations that could provide motive for foul play. The tattoos on the arm included distinctive markings that matched people who knew Smith, and that identification shifted the case. It ceased to be a zoological oddity and became, suddenly, a homicide inquiry. The question became, if Smith was the owner of that arm, what happened to the rest of his body, and who would benefit from his disappearance?
To understand motive, we need to map the web around Smith. He wasn't operating in isolation. He had business partners, some legitimate, some not, and he rubbed shoulders with bookmakers and others involved in gambling enterprises. There were small financial schemes, sometimes involving insurance or betting operations, and a lot of trust exchanged in a handshake rather than a contract. When money went missing or allegations of fraud emerged, people within those circles often settled scores internally.
One man in particular emerged in the investigation as central to Smith's affairs. He was a business associate, someone who had shared ventures with Smith and, according to several later accounts, stood to gain if Smith disappeared. I'm careful here because the documentary record isn't perfect. Witness statements were inconsistent, press reporting could be sensational, and many details rely on police notes and trial transcripts. But it's fair to say that this associate, let's call him the prime suspect for now, was placed under suspicion largely because of motive and circumstantial evidence linking him to Smith shortly before Smith was last seen.
Exactly. And there's an important procedural note. Without a body, the prosecution's case had to stitch motive, opportunity, and fragmentary physical evidence together. They relied heavily on witnesses who placed Smith with the suspect, on patterns of financial gain, and on the peculiar fact of the arm. But an arm, severed and found inside a shark, doesn't tell you where the killing happened, who wielded a weapon, or even definitively whether death was homicidal or the result of some other misadventure.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the forensic puzzle. The arm itself raised many questions. Pathologists of the day examined it and reported signs that suggested it had been severed by a sharp instrument rather than torn off by a shark bite. There were clean cuts that implied human intervention. There were also indications about how long the arm had been in the water and how much tissue remained. Evidence that allowed pathologists to estimate, roughly, time since separation. But here's the problem. In the 1930s, forensic pathology lacked modern tools. There was no DNA, no systematic time-of-death markers were used today, and microscopy could only take you so far. The arm could suggest dismemberment, certainly, but it could not place a killer's hands on the blade. It couldn't tell if the severing occurred on land or at sea, although the state of the cut suggested it had been made before the arm entered the water. Still, no torso, no crime scene, no clear weapon. Those are major evidentiary gaps.
And gaps in evidence create space for alternate narratives. The defense in the subsequent trial exploited those gaps aggressively. They argued that the arm's condition could be read in different ways, that witnesses who tied their client to Smith were unreliable or motivated, and that the prosecution scenario depended on assumption and inference rather than proof. When you're working with circumstantial evidence, the standard of beyond reasonable doubt becomes a steep hill to climb.
Let's walk through the prosecution's theory for clarity. Their narrative was that Smith had been murdered on land, dismembered with a sharp instrument, and that parts of his body had been disposed of, one of those parts ending up in the sea. The tiger shark ate or swallowed the arm, and it later regurgitated it in an aquarium, which is how the arm was found. The motive, they argued, flowed from business disputes and financial benefits the suspect could have received from Smith's disappearance. Sounds simple, except for the many missing pieces. The defense portrayed reasonable alternatives. Perhaps Smith died accidentally, perhaps the arm was separated under different circumstances, perhaps other people were involved. The jury was asked to accept a chain of inferences: identification of the arm as Smith's, the conclusion that his death was a murder orchestrated by this specific suspect, and the assumption that the rest of the body had been disposed of intentionally. That chain, the defense argued, snapped at several links.
There's another factor to mention: the social context of witness testimony. People who operated in the underworld often had motives to mislead, to protect allies, or to settle scores. Witness credibility is always a challenge in cases involving criminal networks. If a key witness has a history of making deals with police or of flipping claims depending on pressure, that undermines the prosecution. The judge and jury in this case were acutely aware that much of the evidence was narrative rather than forensic.
The trial itself had moments that read like courtroom drama. There were witnesses who tried to place Smith at certain locations, others who claimed to have had dealings that suggested motive, and cross-examinations aimed at exposing inconsistencies. The defense systematically highlighted the lack of a body, the impossibility of proving where and when the killing occurred, and the idea that someone else could have disposed of an arm intentionally or accidentally. At the conclusion, the jury returned a not guilty verdict. The prime suspect walked free. Legally, the case closed in the sense that the accused wasn't convicted. Socially, the questions didn't go away. That acquittal is one of the reasons the shark arm case continues to feel unresolved. The trial answered the legal question for one man. He was not proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, but it didn't answer the factual question for the public. Who killed Jimmy Smith, if indeed he was killed?
That acquittal underscores a lesson about standards of proof and the difficulty of proving crimes with limited physical evidence. It also reflects the way uncertainties compound when an investigation is forced to work with a single unusual item, the arm, rather than a broader corpus of physical facts. Without a body, no crime scene, and only marginally reliable witnesses, the prosecution faced an uphill battle.
And then there are all the loose ends. The rest of Smith's body was never found. No murder weapon was definitively identified. Over the years, rumours surfaced. Confessions in whispers, boasted admissions in pubs, an underworld man claiming to know what happened before he died. But none of these produced verifiable proof. Statements contradicted each other. Some later claims smelled of opportunism, attempts to craft a story for a willing audience or to settle a grudge after years had passed. There are logical reasons why the rest of the body might never be found. If a body was disposed of at sea, currents, scavenging, and the passage of time can make recovery impossible. If the killers dismembered the body and disposed of parts in different places, the trail scatters. If, as some have suggested, those involved had local influence and disposed of evidence through networks that discouraged further police digging, then records and physical traces would be suppressed. We have to weigh those practical factors when considering why the case remained unresolved.
It's also worth noting that records and institutional memory fade. Police techniques in the 1930s, paper notebooks, local witnesses, a smaller press corps, leave gaps. Papers are lost, accounts go unrecorded, potential witnesses die. When an investigation doesn't deliver a conviction quickly, evidence often deteriorates or vanishes. That institutional attrition is why many cold cases from that era are effectively frozen.
Which brings us to alternative theories. There are three broad lines that people consider when they try to make sense of this puzzling file. Theory 1. The dominant theory in court and in contemporary reporting, murder for gain. Smith was killed by associates over money, betrayal, or an insurance scheme. He was dismembered to conceal the crime, and parts were dumped at sea. The shark's ingestion of the arm was a grim coincidence that exposed only a fragment of the crime. Theory 2. A deliberate underworld cleanup and message. In this version, the disposal was intentionally slotty in a way that sent a signal, either to show power or to create fear, while still allowing those responsible to avoid formal consequences through intimidation and obfuscation. The arm might have been dumped in water, trusting that the sea would dissolve traces, while the public spectacle of the aquarium was an accidental reveal. Theory 3. A less conspiratorial but still unsettling option, an accidental death or misadventure, then covered up. Perhaps Smith died unexpectedly during a fight or boating incident, and people panicked, dismembering the body in haste to avoid discovery. Over time, rumours hardened into the narrative of a planned murder. It's messy, but messy explanations often fit messy crimes better than tidy plots.
Each theory has strengths and weaknesses. The murder for gain theory explains motive and who stood to benefit, and it aligns with the arm's apparent pre-entry dismemberment. But it struggles with the lack of physical proof connecting any single person to the act. The cleanup/message theory fits the culture of violence and showmanship in some criminal circles, but it assumes a level of theatrical intent that isn't always present. The accidental death cover-up accounts for sloppy disposal, but it relies on the idea that otherwise law-abiding people would choose dismemberment over a more plausible alternative, something that, to many, stretches credulity.
Forensic limitations tip the balance too. The pathologist's report suggested a sharp instrument had been used. That detail weakens a pure accident theory unless you imagine a panicked attempt to hide a death that included making the body unrecognizable. But it doesn't prove premeditation. So we are left weighing probabilities rather than certainties, a position I prefer to being seduced by a single solution that fits the drama but not the evidence.
If I may, Ellie, another way to frame the issue is to think like a cautious juror. The state needed to prove that a killing had occurred and that this person had done it. They used the arm as a bridge to both conclusions, but that bridge had missing planks. The most plausible story might be that people around Smith did him harm, but plausible isn't proof. And the passage of time reduces the chance that we'll ever find new, decisive evidence.
That's the tension at the heart of the case, Marcus. We have an image burned into the cultural imagination, an arm in a shark, a trial that captivated the city, but the material facts remain fragmentary. Those fragments invite stories, which then ossify into cultural memory. The more sensational the image, the more it becomes a kind of legend, and the more actual evidence is smoothed over or forgotten. I want to pause and be clear about something. When we talk about people accused and acquitted, there's real human consequence. Names in the press, reputations ruined, relationships fractured. The man acquitted walked free, but the social cost lingers. For Jimmy Smith, if he was indeed the arm's owner, there's a lack of justice that is simply a human tragedy. And that tragedy is part of why we keep circling the case.
Another aspect worth considering: the media's role. Newspapers in 1935 smelled a story that would sell papers. The image is sensational and primed for readers hungry for the macabre and the criminal. That environment can distort both public perception and the investigative record. Sensational reporting can introduce inaccuracies that later researchers have to untangle from the facts. In short, media attention helps make the case famous, but it doesn't necessarily help solve it.
Famous for all the wrong reasons. And perhaps that's why the shark arm case haunts us. It sits at the intersection of nature, an animal acting like an animal, and human violence and secrecy. The surreal tableau of a shark disgorging a tattooed arm forces us to confront how incomplete our knowledge of a single life can be. We love answers. This case supplies tantalizing hints, but not closure. Before we finish, Marcus, let me ask you a direct question. Based on the evidence as it stands, tattoos identifying Smith, pathologist notes suggesting dismemberment, the suspect's motive and opportunity, what do you think is the most likely scenario?
If I have to weigh probabilities rather than produce a verdict, I would say this. The balance of evidence points to foul play involving people within Smith's circle. The motive aligns, the arms condition suggests pre-water dismemberment, and the pattern of disputes makes it plausible that someone would have cause to eliminate him. But, and this is important, the absence of a body or a weapon means there's reasonable doubt about the specific identity of the killer and the manner of the killing. So, probable murder by associates, but not provable beyond reasonable doubt.
That's measured and, I think, fair. Probable, but not proven. The state required proof, and it did not get it. The result is a story that encourages speculation and the creation of alternative narratives, some plausible, some mythic. So, for our listeners who like to play detective at home, what should you look for if you're judging these theories? First, motive. Who benefits? Trace financial ledgers, even if they're informal. Who gained after Smith's disappearance? Second, opportunity. Who was seen with Smith or had proximity? Third, credibility of witnesses. What might make someone lie or misremember? Fourth, the physical evidence. What does the arm actually tell us, and does it contradict witness accounts? And finally, institutional context. Did the police pursue every lead, or were there constraints and biases that shaped the investigation?
I'd add, Think about what would be decisive evidence today. A torso, DNA, or reliable new witness testimony could change the picture. But absent that, we have to accept that some cases will be probabilistic. We can say what's likely, but not always what's certain. In historical crimes, that is often the final, unsatisfying truth.
Unsatisfying, but also honest. Now, before we close, I want to acknowledge the stories that followed. Over the decades, the shark arm case became shorthand in Australia for a certain kind of macabre mystery. Books and pieces of journalism revisited it. People came forward with claims, sometimes late-life confessions, sometimes rumour. None produced the kind of verification that would change the record. If anything, those later claims remind us how memory and myth can accrete around an event, and why we must treat late confessions with cautious skepticism. For those who like the darker corners of history, the case also intersected with broader fears about the underworld. The image of a man discarded and eaten by the sea fit into narratives about violent criminality and the risks of shady dealings. It's easy and tempting to let the story become a morality tale, but that temptation can obscure the human facts, names, relationships, and the loss of a life that never got a proper accounting.
One final practical note. Archives are not inexhaustible. For listeners who might be curious and want to research further, be aware that police files, newspaper archives, and court records exist but may be fragmented. Some key documents can be located in state libraries and police archives, but the context is often incomplete. And as Ellie said earlier, the more sensational a story, the more likely distortions have crept in. Approach primary sources with care.
So let me summarize the unresolved questions one more time. Who killed Jimmy Smith? If someone did, was the man acquitted actually the perpetrator? Was the arm's discovery a horrific accident that exposed a different truth? And why was the rest of the body never found? Those are the gaps that keep this story alive and that make it, in the words of this show, still unanswered. Now, a small challenge to you, our listeners. If you had to pick the single most persuasive theory, murder for gain, underworld message, or accidental death covered up, which would you pick and why? Think about which pieces of evidence you find most compelling. Is the tattooed arm and the pathologist's notes enough to outweigh the missing body? Or do the holes in the record make the jury's doubt sensible? Share your reasoning. We read your letters and emails, and sometimes listener contributions help illuminate corners of a case researchers missed. I want to close with an image that always stays with me. A windowed tank in a seaside aquarium, sun cutting across water, a crowd gathered for spectacle. In that ordinary scene, something extraordinary intruded. An arm marked with tattoos, with stories on it that we'll never fully know, became the only tangible remnant of a life. For me, that image is a reminder of how fragile the material traces of a person can be, and how easily a single, strange item can become the basis for a whole narrative, accurate in parts, false in others, incomplete in all. Thank you to Dr. Marcus Llewellyn for joining me today, and thank you to all of you listening. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to Still Unanswered. If you have documents, memories, or local lore about the shark arm case, send them in. We'll treat submissions carefully. Archival evidence is always welcome. Until next time, consider the gaps, weigh the evidence, and keep asking why. I'm Eleanor Hart. This has been Still Unanswered.
Thanks, Ellie. And to listeners, keep asking the hard questions. Sometimes the most responsible stance is to say, we don't know enough yet.